Respected Professor Szilágyi, dear professors, dear students, dear colleagues, let me first greet you and express my belief that this is an extraordinary scientific meeting that will undoubtedly resonate not only in the academic and scientific community of Central Europe, but also beyond. I am really very happy because this is my first international conference in the so-called post-COVID period outside of Serbia, if I exclude my engagement in the work of the Venice Commission. It is a proof that, in a certain sense, we are returning to normal academic life. I am also very happy that I am here in Budapest at a conference which is organized by University of Miskolc and co-organized, among others, by the University of Miskolc Faculty of Law and Ferenc Mádl Institute of Comparative Law, in which institutions this year in April I gave lectures on the topic of constitutional identity for the students of doctoral studies. As a professor engaged in doctoral studies in these institutions, today I feel at home. Dear organizers, please accept the expressions of my deep gratitude for allowing my colleague Professor Đorđević and me, and then colleague Professor Korhec, to speak as primus inter pares. It is an exceptional compliment, not only for us, but also to the Constitutional Court of Serbia, as well as to Serbia as a state which maintains the best possible partnership and friendly relations with the state and the people of Hungary. Before I give the floor to my younger colleague, Mr. Đorđević, who participated with me in drafting constitutional amendments on the judiciary last year, which have brought Serbia closer to the values of European constitutional identity in this field, I would like to say just three more things. First of all, the concept of constitutional identity is in its internal aspect as national constitutional identity, and in its external or international aspect as European constitutional identity, is a topic of the highest importance in the constitutional law of every modern democratic national state, as well as in the contemporary comparative constitutional law. This is even more emphasized today when major global and regional restructurings in power relations are on the horizon. If a national state in Europe wants to survive and develop in these difficult times, it must respect its political and constitutional identity, in any case based on the universal values of respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It also must respect the same identities of other national states, as well as the civilizational achievements of the international public law. Above all, it should sincerely be ready to participate in a common European identity. I consider the word sincerely, instead of the words hypocritical or selfish, to be the key to the strategic success of the process of reforming not only the EU as a quasi-federal community, but at the first place, Europe as a major force of unification in diversity. Second, this paper is an attempt to present national constitutional history, which is definitely one of the main sources of constitutional identity of the state, more objectively, without dangerous constitutional chimeras characteristic of the period from the beginning of the 19th of the 20th century to the present. That is the only way to use national constitutional history as a legitimate source for building modern national constitutional identity. In this respect, we find important to analyze more impartially the role and the influence of the first modern constitution of Serbia of 1990, often called the Milosevic constitution for pure political reasons, in restructuring Serbia as a democratic legal state. Third, in this paper, the periodization of Serbian constitutional history is given from the perspective of the national constitutional identity. That is not only a new, rather original periodization which has the significance for constitutional law of Serbia as a legal discipline, but it is an attempt to find the roots of modern Serbian constitutionality that will be structured in the future constitutional reforms in Serbia on the European path. That path, like that of any other national state worthy of respect, in order to be right, must be based from below and from within, and not imposed from above and without, by the use of hypocritical quasi-democratic phraseology. Now I have the pleasure to give a floor to Mr. Đorđević, who will tell you something about our work in more details. I am open to questions in the period of debate. Thank you very much for this.
While we wait for the presentation to start, let me first say that I would really like to thank our hosts. We're so happy to be here. It's an honor and privilege to be a participant of such an important scientific undertaking as the one that you've taken upon yourselves. It is one step forward in what we're all trying to achieve, spreading the idea of constitutionalism, comparative constitutionalism, looking forward for the answers on some, let's say, eternal questions like the question of the constitutional identity, and basically bringing scholars together in order to strive for solutions that would make lives in our countries better. Excuse me. So the topic of our chapter was the influence of Serbia's historical constitutions on its modern constitutional identity. Whenever we deal with legal history of any kind, especially when it comes to foreign country, it is often difficult to follow because all the different dates and years, and in the case of Serbia, so many countries that change on the same soil. So therefore we have created this timeline that you also have, because we weren't sure if the screen is going to be big enough for all of you to see. Maybe it will be a little bit easier for you to follow where we are when we talk about the particular historical constitution. So first, this is really an oversimplified, probably, timeline of Serbian history, modern history, starting with 1804, with the end of the Ottoman rule and the first Serbian uprising. We had the Principality of Serbia. After Berlin, a couple of years after the Congress of Berlin in 1978, it changed into Kingdom of Serbia. To lose later its statehood when it merged into Kingdom of Yugoslavia after the First World War. After the Second World War, much like here in Hungary, we had a socialist state, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and then when the Berlin Wall fell and we had a collapse of the communist regime, we had a series of horrible wars, after which the third, so-called third small Yugoslavia emerged, consisting only of Serbia and Montenegro. Finally, in 2006, for Serbia to sort of regain its independence and become the Republic of Serbia as it is now. So on the upper part of the timeline, you have the important dates for the Serbian statehood. I have to state it once again, it's a little bit simplified, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but for the sake of this chapter and this presentation, it's enough. On the lower part, you have important dates, which are actually years when particular Serbian constitutions were enacted. So starting with the first one is the Constitution of 1835. Very much praised within the Serbian scholarly circles because it was the very first full written complete Serbian constitution. It was incredibly liberal and advanced for that time, even for the European countries, and not just for Serbia, which was still formally under the Ottoman rule, of course, with a large autonomy. It was that much advanced and that much liberal that it presented a sort of thorn in the eye for the great European powers of the time that were quick to abolish it somehow, so it is often regarded as a stillborn. It remained in power for around 6 weeks. Hence, it is more of a symbol when we're talking about our constitutional history than it was sort of sincere normative expression, since it actually never truly came to power. And it is a big question whether such a liberal and advanced constitution, as we've said in the introductory words, would be suitable for a territory or a country as Serbia was back then. So the next one, a couple of years later, 1938, we had the Turkish constitution, overall less liberal, imposed by Istanbul. What is somewhat maybe interesting to say here, originally written by a famous Serbian legal scholar who wrote the Serbian Civil Code of 1844, which was the fourth one in Europe, so quite an early one, and who got educated here in Budapest. He studied philosophy and law here in Budapest and then continued his education later in Vienna. Since this was an imposed constitution, it isn't that important for our constitutional identity and for finding out the milestones of our own constitutional identity. And we'll go to the next one, which is far more important. So in 1869, Serbia is practically independent, although not yet fully recognized by international community as such. We had a constitution that proclaimed constitutional monarchy, so this was not constitutional parliamentary monarchy, but only constitutional monarchy. Still, it was one of the rare examples of the living constitution, meaning that this wasn't maybe the most advanced constitution of the time, but it was suitable and it was well written for the people it was supposed to be in power for. It had moderate limitations of prince's power, and it certainly had many limitations concerning human rights, especially when it comes to political rights, though it was a fine example of the authentic constitutionality that actually was applied in practice. The next one is, in our scholarly circles and maybe beyond, the famous radical constitution of 1988. Here it states 1888-1903, because it was abolished and then brought back in 1903. Often qualified as the best, most advanced Serbian constitution ever, it introduced certain institutes as a proportional electoral system that was a novelty in the Europe at the time. But it was, maybe similarly to the first Serbian constitution, it was too experimental, maybe it was too advanced, it was too optimistic, and as we find and agree with some scholars who say in some parts even delusional in that sense. So the next one is the imposed constitution of 1901, authoritarian constitution, hence not interesting for what we are looking here. And also one note, here on the lower part of each slide, you have the coat of arms and the name of the state where we're at the moment, and on the timeline it's shown which period of our statehood we're talking about and the year of the present constitution. So we came to an end of Serbia's constitutionality and came to the time of Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia were not in focus of our paper, especially the second one, since it doesn't actually have influence on the current constitutional identity. It was more of an post-Soviet model. When it comes to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, it was an attempt to create a new nation, so to say, Geburt einer Nation. It was an attempt that failed. And it did, however, contain some of the characteristics of the previous Serbian constitutionality. Hence, it should be mentioned. But it wouldn't be a constitution that would be chosen as one of the milestones of our constitutional identity. Next one, Constitution of 1931, also Kingdom of Yugoslavia, an imposed authoritarian constitution, hence not the one that we will further consider. Now we come to the Constitution of 1990. As Professor Petrov already mentioned, really important constitution for us for political reasons, declared as Milosevic's constitution, which it in a way really was. It was enacted during the reign of Milosevic, but it also meant a return to the liberal democratic constitutionality, and it was an important step in our constitutional development. If you take a look at the lower left corner, you will see the old socialist coat of arms of Serbia, because this constitution was actually enacted before the dissolution of the socialist Yugoslavia, but it was, however, written with the anticipation of what was unfortunately, but some would say inevitably, to follow, and that is the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and something that we could definitely have avoided, series of horrible wars. This constitution introduced a list of large catalog of human rights, introduced free economy, free market, semi-presidential system, and maybe the most important, the return of the multi-party system. And it leads us to the presently, the constitution that's currently forced as the Serbian constitution of 2006, with the already mentioned amendments of this year, where Professor Petrov was basically leading this group. He was presiding over this working group for the writing of the constitutional amendments, and I was honored to be one member of that group. This constitution is, however, heavily criticized by the Venice Commission. It was for series of reasons, but that is a totally different story at the moment. I won't go into more detail. I just want to say that it was largely based on the Constitution of 1990, hence didn't move the question of the constitutional identity of Serbia. It introduced some improvements, but also suffers from some major flaws, many of them in the domain of judiciary that we tried to correct somehow with this series of constitutional amendments. So now finally, when we went through all this overview of the Serbian constitution, the question of periodization. There can be a couple of criteria for periodization. You could do that from the standpoint of state sovereignty regarding to distinctive periods of world constitutionality. There are some sui generis periodization of famous Serbian scholars, but we were trying to create periodization from the standpoint of constitutional identity, what hasn't been done before in our scholarly papers. In order to categorize something according to constitutional identity, one has to know what constitutional identity represents. And it is one of the most vague and uncertain concepts when it comes to constitutional law. There are so many definitions, and we were led by rather broad, but we would think right, the definition that constitutional identity is somewhat of a heart of the constitution, its essence, which cannot or is hard to change. One of the first questions that emerged, and Professor Petrov already spoke about it, so I won't go into to repeat his words too much, but the question of the European identity versus the national identity when it comes to constitutional identity. We think that there's no concurrence between the two, and then the principle of applying European values with respect to the national constitutional identity is possible and should be practiced. Serbia is not yet the member of the European Union, though we are striving for the membership, hopefully. But in Serbian constitution, in the very first article, it states that the Republic of Serbia is a state based on commitment to European principles and values. And that is something that we were trying to integrate into our current contemporary constitutional identity, also with the constitutional amendments. So, according to this concept, there are 4 milestones of Serbian constitutional identity. The first one, because of its importance as a symbol and its impact that it left on scholarly circles. Then we have 2 constitutions, historical ones of 69 and 88, and traces from norms of these constitutions can or could be found nowadays in the present constitution. And of course, Constitution of 1990 that I spoke about. And now we come to our periodization. We try to make it clearer with this another timeline. There could be 6 periods, could be recognized according to criteria of constitutional identity. We have first the era of laying constitutional foundations, then the era of the authentic constitutionalism, maybe not the most advanced one, but certainly authentic one. The era of declarative parliamentarism, when we were striving for more than we could actually achieve. The era of non-independent constitutionalism of the authoritarian type. Then we had the socialist constitutionalism, and the present one, which is trying to be a new authentic constitutionalism, striving for European values and identity and constitutional heritage. Still, many questions and issues remain in front of us. What has always been a problem with our constitutionalism, we never seem to find a really balanced system of power. And the first point here is related to the third one. We have to determine that sweet spot, so to say, between parliamentarism and presidentialism. If the particular political circumstances are met, the center of true power can shift. And the second one is to determine the realistic scope of protection of human rights and freedoms according to European standards. This means too much is bad, too little is bad. We want true protection of human rights, not the declarative one, and also not the restrictive one. So the right measure has to be found with the idea of Serbian constitutional identity in mind. And finally, to strategically resolve Kosovo and Metohija political issue. It is a long story and a difficult one. We offer some ideas in this paper. And also, I hope I didn't speak too long, and I really hope that this presentation motivated you to read our chapter. And I would like to thank you for everything and leave you with this. This is the picture of the Emperor Dušan's code from the mid-14th century, which is one of the oldest Serbian pre-constitutions that, for example, proclaimed the full judicial independence. And hence we can look to our somewhat rich history for inspiration, but still we have a lot in front of us, a lot of issues that we have to resolve. Thank you so much for your attention, and as Professor said, we remain open for your questions later. Thank you.